here we are again. I'm Professor Papsdorf, once again, back with you, drinking more coffee and getting ready to talk about Catholic social teaching. Now, again, the coffee here is, I guess, my own personal little opening example for thinking about some of the issues related to Catholic social teaching. But I also want to just remind us of some of the things we talked about last time, right? That any action that we take, even something as ordinary as drinking coffee, has all kinds of ramifications and all sorts of things that we need to consider from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. And again, just to give you a little more kind of background and knowing who your professor is and kind of what makes me tick. This morning I thought I'd, share a slightly different way of having coffee as opposed to what you saw last time. You can brew coffee kind of the standard way we saw there, or here in my office, you can see kind of behind my shoulder there, the French press I keep in my office and a little bag of coffee from a local coffee roaster and grinder. And it makes a very nice cup of coffee. But apart from the questions, of course, of the type of coffee or how it tastes or how you prepare it, there are all those moral issues, right? Is it moral for me to be drinking this coffee? Is it in keeping with the Church's teaching about how we ought to live and how we ought to support the good of other people throughout the world? And so that's what I want us to be thinking about here in this module, thinking about in this course. And so last time we left off, we talked about how Catholic social teaching is really rooted in the Church's teaching, all through Scripture, through tradition, into the teaching of the current popes. But also left off with the idea that this is a whole lot of material to think about, right? This is a lot of stuff to sort of wrap our heads around in trying to deal with day-to-day issues. And so I pointed out to you that our textbook for the class, this compendium of the Church's social doctrine, is going to be a handy guide for getting a basic understanding of the issues and of the principles involved. And so to kind of use this as our guide, it makes sense, I think, to kind of start at the beginning. And so if you look at your compendium, the beginning part of it starts off with talking about the nature of the human person and pointing out some specific characteristics of what kind of creatures we are as human beings, which are then the foundation for the basic principles of Catholic social teaching that we're going to be working through and explaining a little bit here in this module. So as I sip my coffee, and perhaps as you sip yours or your tea or whatever it is that gets you through the modules, I want to take a little time now to do just that, to go through some of these opening parts of the compendium, and not, of course, reiterate everything it has to say. You can read it for yourself, but just to draw your attention to some of the key features, the key ideas that stand out for me, and hopefully to give you a little bit of an introduction to what's going on here in the compendium. So I want to start off by looking at what it has to say about the nature of the human person. So when the compendium is leading us to think about the human person from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective, from a Catholic perspective, how does it suggest we do that? Well, one of the key things that is really addressed at the very beginning is thinking about the human person as someone involved in the story of salvation, right? And one of the things that we see in all the courses is this story of salvation just looked at from different perspectives, right? That we all live in this tension that we discussed in that first module between a good created world full of beings created in the image of God, who are good creatures, who are in relationships with each other, with God, with the world around us. That's all good. But then, of course, there's the tension with the affirmation of that goodness while also recognizing the reality of sin, right? And that those good relationships, those good natures have been corrupted. And of course, we have the whole history of humanity as we know it is the story of the conflict kind of between those ideas, between the good in people, the good in the world around us, and the evil and corruption that permeates all through our world, all through our cultures and history. But of course, as Christians, it's not as bleak as that, right? We're not locked in this eternal struggle between dark and light, good and evil, that we do in fact find in some other religious and philosophical traditions, right? Where it's just seen as the nature of things, that there is always going to be this tension between good and evil, dark and light, if you will. But in Christianity, of course, we believe that it's not going to be that way, that ultimately good will prevail, light will prevail. And in fact, in a real way, it already has prevailed, right? That Christ has already won the decisive victory over evil through his death and resurrection. Now, of course, we are still dealing with sort of the aftermath, if you will, right? That the decisive victory has been won, but the war isn't quite wrapped up yet, right? And that there continues to be a working out of the struggle, right? Even though the decisive victory has happened, we still have to deal with the reality of evil in the world. But we can have real hope, right? That ultimately good will prevail and God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it is ultimately a hopeful story, right? Of good beings who have been corrupted by sin, but who have also been redeemed, right? And that there is this real truth of redemption. And so one of the challenges, I just bring this up, of course it's in your compendium, you can read about it more there, but I think it's important to talk about this because so many times when we talk about Catholic social teaching and social justice, it can be a real downer, right? It can be really depressing because we're going to look at all sorts of political and economic and military and legal situations, right, where things seem really bleak and where there is a lot of evil in the world. There is a lot of suffering. And you can really feel like it's not going to turn out well. I'm recording this during Lent right now, right? And it can have a very Lenten feel to it when you talk about Catholic social teaching. Just depressing to run through all of these ways that human beings are horrible to each other, to the world around them. But Lent is not the end of the story, right? Lent leads up to Easter. And the same is true here, right? That we can talk about these evils and problems in the world, but ultimately it will be set right, right? Ultimately God will prevail. So we need to keep that ultimate goal, that ultimate joy and hope in mind as we go through some of these more depressing conversations at times. So in addition to looking at the human person in the context of this story of salvation, the compendium also runs through a number of other ways of looking at the human person that are going to be helpful to keep in mind as we look at the specific issues that we're going to address here in the course. And so I'll just walk you through some of the key features that stand out in the compendium. So one key idea, right, is the unity of the person. And again, this is something we talk a lot about in natural law, but it's worth bringing up again here, right, that a Christian understanding of the person sees the person as body and soul together, right? And so that we are not Gnostics, right? And we are not materialists. We don't believe that we are just our body, just our brains, and that's all there is to it. Nor do we believe that we are just our immaterial spirit or that we are just our intellect and sort of the body is unimportant, right? That what Christianity does when it approaches this issue, as with so many things, is that it's not either or, it's both and, right? So that a person is the unique combination of body and soul together. And so given that reality, right, when we're talking about the real good of human persons, we need to make sure that we keep in mind that we're talking about persons who are body and soul, right? So that what can be a temptation many times for us as Christians is to focus on the spirit, focus on the soul, right? Say, well, what matters most is getting souls to heaven. Well, souls in heaven is a good thing, but we also need whole persons in heaven, right? We need, in eternity, we will be resurrected, embodied beings. Because our bodies really are us in a real essential way, and they really do matter. And by extension, the way we care for and treat the bodies of others is also important, right? It's not just about saving souls. It's about healing illness. It's about feeding hunger. It's about satisfying thirst and clothing the naked. And all those things that Jesus talks about much more eloquently in Matthew's gospel when it comes to the end of time and at the final judgment. One of the deciding factors will not just be, did we save souls, but did we care for people, embodied people who have real bodily material needs. And so that's an essential thing to keep in mind. It's not just this kind of philosophical Christian belief. It is, in fact, an integral part of what we believe about the human person that has real consequences for the way we live and the way we live out our faith. Now, along with that, we believe that each person is transcendent and unique, right? And so again, this is contrary to the way a lot of people in our world see it, right? That the real focus is on humanity, or we look at human beings in sort of evolutionary terms, that what really matters is humanity as a whole, or getting humanity kind of the next phase in evolution or something like that. Or it can happen certainly politically, right, where the focus is on the nation, or the proletariat if we were going to be Marxists, or what have you. Right? In Christianity, we're going to say that yes, we are part of a humanity as a whole, but that each individual has a unique value. Each individual is transcendent, right? That our existence is not limited to this world as we currently know it, but we will indeed continue to exist in relationship with God in eternity, right? So there is a real transcendent value to each individual person. Now, tied in with that is a belief in real, true freedom, right? That each human person is made in the image of God, is destined for this eternal relationship with God, and as a result, has a free will, right? Has a real ability to choose for good or evil, and that we ought to acknowledge the free will that exists in other people and allow them to exercise that free will to determine for themselves kind of their ultimate goals and how they're going to pursue them. Along with that, right, so we have this affirmation of the value of the individual, the ability to exercise free will, but balancing that in a way is an emphasis on the equal dignity of persons, right? Because when we start focusing on each individual's unique ability to kind of chart their own way or make their own decisions, there is also a temptation to evaluate people based on their choices, based on their abilities, right? And to see those who can exercise that free will, say, on a higher level, as being more valuable than those who are limited in how they can express that free will, right? Especially those with disabilities, but also children or the elderly or those who aren't as capable of doing some of the things that we would see as valuable. That there's a tendency to link the value of the person with that exercise of free will, with that exercise of self-determination, right? So the church, while it affirms the value of those things, also calls us to afford everyone equal dignity, right? That each person should be treated as having that transcendent unique value simply by being a human person, a human being. And that while there might be various capabilities and abilities, everyone has ultimately the same value, even if they might exercise particular roles, right? So turning away then from just looking at individuals, we need to also then look at individuals' relationship with one another, right? That we are in fact social beings as well. So it's not just me and God and me in pursuit of this transcendent existence in eternity, but it is in fact us in relationship with God, us in relationship with one another, because human beings are social, right? And of course this goes back to natural law, this goes back to Aristotle. We talked about in discussing natural law in that course how Aristotle's understanding of the human person is really central and foundational to natural law. And Aristotle sees the human person as this combination of body and soul together. And Aristotle, of course, again, too, very famously sees human beings as social and political beings, right? That a human person is not really, in some ways, complete as a person if they're in isolation, right? That we have to exist as social beings. We are meant for relationships with others. And in fact, we are meant for relationships with others in sort of multiple levels or multiple spheres in our lives. that we have relationships with family, we have relationships with friends, we have working relationships, we have political relationships. All of this you can see in Aristotle's discussion of a good life, of a flourishing life. And all of that is carried over into the understanding of the human person in Catholic social teaching. And we'll see this very clearly in the principles we're about to talk about, that the good of the human person is connected with being social and having relationships on multiple levels, right? That it's not just me and the state, it's not just me and my family. It is family, friends, workplace, community, state. All of these things go into a truly flourishing, a truly successful human life. And then lastly, one of the things here to kind of finish off this discussion of the human person in the compendium is this discussion of human rights. And this gets a good bit of attention in the compendium. And human rights is something that we talk a lot about in the political world today, and that's something that's seen as a positive thing in the compendium. But of course, it's important to note, as is noted there, that these rights exist because of the things we've been talking about, because of the nature of man, because of the way God created human beings, right? That these rights are not something that result from pure political will, right? That we cannot arbitrarily create rights through a vote. We don't create rights through what we desire necessarily. That the rights of the human person are rooted in the real created nature of the human person as we've been discussing it here and as we see it expressed in scripture and tradition and in the world around us, right? That we can look at the world and gain an understanding of the human person to understand the rights that the human person ought to have. Rights that are connected to that recognition of transcendence and uniqueness of the individual, connected with that belief in valuing the dignity of every human life, every human being, equally regardless of their ability or the role they may play in society. So again, you can certainly read for yourself, and I'll ask you to, more on all of these topics, but those are some of the key things to bear in mind about the nature of the human person as we shift now to start looking at what are the specific principles that the Church would give us based on this understanding of the human person to then guide our decisions when we are working and acting in the world today and in the different social systems that we're a part of. So we've covered the basic foundation of the understanding of the human person that's at the root of Catholic social teaching. So let's really get now to looking specifically at some of the basic principles that are going to serve as our sort of norms in going through the different discussions and controversies that we're going to be looking at here in the course. And if you do some reading in Catholic social teaching and read different books and articles, you're going to encounter a variety of different lists of the principles of Catholic social teaching. Some of them are fairly extensive and some are briefer. So I'm going to simply use the list of principles given here in the opening of the compendium as our guideline because it's a pretty comprehensive list. And really, when you look at the lists, they're more or less equivalent in most cases. It's just a question of how specific you get on some of the different principles. One thing that's not really covered in this particular list in the compendium is a principle addressing stewardship or care for creation explicitly, although that is a topic covered in the compendium, and we will incorporate that as we go along. But for now, we're going to use this pretty brief listing of the principles as our working guide for this module and as we launch into discussing specific issues in the coming weeks. All right, so then let's take a look at these. So the first up that the compendium presents for our consideration is the principle of the common good. All right, well, what do we mean by supporting the principle of the common good? Well, on one level, it should be obvious enough, right, that when we are acting in society, when we are making choices, when we are working within the different social systems and institutions that we are a part of, we ought to do that in a way that promotes the common good. Now, what do we mean by that when we get a little more specific about it? And here's where things will get a little more interesting, right? Because one of the things that you'll see in the compendium specifically spelled out is that when we talk about the common good, we're not just talking about the individual good of the different members of society, right? So we wouldn't be supporting the common good in the sense meant here if we simply adopted a policy that maximized the individual profit of everybody affected by a decision. Now, look, there's nothing necessarily wrong with individual profit, right? And as we will talk about, private property and the profit of business that contributes to that is a perfectly useful tool and something acknowledged as good and useful in Catholic social teaching. But that's not what's being touched on here with this principle of the common good. Right? The common good refers more to a good that is really held in common by the community, right? So that we need to act in a way that is going to support a real community, right? That we are going to share, right? So in earlier times, right, this would have been very kind of clearly demonstrated by the village commons, right? That there used to be at the center of many villages and towns a commons, which was a big green space, and now there's still commons in some cities in America. You can go to Boston Commons, for example. It's a big green park and people can go take their picnics there. But in earlier times, the commons were common grazing land, right? That you would use the commons as a way to support the flocks of those in the town. And that everyone had a vested interest in this common good, right? And so if one individual abused it or used too much of this common good, it would create problems. And people would be called upon to do their part to support and care for this common good, right? And there is a value to this beyond just the economic output, right? By having this common good, it in some ways facilitates, in some ways forces you to act as a community. That if you're going to support and develop this common good, you have to work together. You have to have discussions and relationships that are going to be used to support this common good, right? And so an example that comes to mind more in modern American life, in some ways modern, is you know, the Amish. If you have a barn raising, that would be kind of a sort of a common good, that the people come together, there's a collective good of the community's labor that is fostered and shared, and it benefits individuals, but there's also a real communal aspect to it. And so supporting the common good might be, in our case, things like infrastructure, things like community services, things like shared spaces, whether it's parks or stadiums or what have you. There could be any number of things. And Catholic social teaching doesn't give specific dictates on parks versus county health services, all those sorts of prudential judgments, but it does say that we should act in a way that supports the common good, that is, supports everyone in our community, but again, not just individualistically, right? That it is, we are called to create and support common goods that we all share, and those goods actually bring us together, right? And again, this is recognizing the nature of the human person as embodied. It's very nice and easy to say, oh yes, yes, we will, you know, we'll get together, we'll have a community, we'll have real relationships. But if there's no actual physical need for that to happen, if we all just commute to our jobs, commute back to our subdivisions, and are self-contained in our own little worlds without some common good to bring us together, it's very easy to fall into isolation, right? So real common goods don't just help everyone as a sum of individuals, but it really creates a community and a common good among the people. So that's one principle to Catholic social teaching, is we need to act in ways that will promote the common good of all people and of particular communities. Okay, together with that, we've already talked about the issue of private property, and that's obviously connected with this. So the next principle of Catholic social teaching we need to talk about is something called the universal destination of goods. Well, what does that mean, right? Well, basically this is talking about the nature of the material world, and it really stretches back to the story of Genesis again. that God creates the physical world. He creates the garden, the animals, the trees, and all of that. And he creates it for human beings, for Adam and Eve, and for their descendants. And the universal destination of goods basically builds on that idea. It says that this created world that we inhabit is created for human beings. So that the goods that we get from the world and the goods that we develop and create through our own creative work and labor in the world are meant for the good of people. But more specifically, the physical world as a whole, the goods that we get from it, are designed for the good of all people. Right? And this is saying on a fundamental level, the goods of creation are meant for the good of human beings. Now what this is doing basically, apart from just reiterating Genesis, is providing us with a broader way of looking at property or personal or private property in a broader theological context. As I've said before, right, Catholic social teaching does support the idea of private property, right? So John Paul II condemns communism, condemns Marxism, right? In large part because, well, for many reasons, it doesn't respect the value and dignity of each person, and also because it doesn't in fact lead to true human flourishing, that human beings tend not to live well when there is no private property, that people need a sense of ownership, a sense of personal responsibility in order to really make good use of the material world. But this principle of the universal destination of goods is sort of a balance to that, right? It is to say that yes, we ought to have private property. Yes, we ought to work for the benefit of ourselves and our families. But we need to always bear in mind that the ultimate goal is not profit. The ultimate goal is not the accumulation of private property. The ultimate goal is the good of persons, myself and my family, but also the good of the community and the good of everyone. And private property, while a good, true thing, is in fact an instrumental good, right? It is not an ultimate good. That private property is good and valid to the extent that it supports the true good of persons. And if we pursue private property and accumulate private property in a way or to an extent that it ultimately undermines the true good of persons, then theologically speaking, we no longer have a real right to that property. Because really the ultimate aim of the material world as a whole is for the true good of all people. And so if we accumulate property in a way that actually undermines that, we are actually undermining the real basis for property. And theologically speaking, that accumulation of property that becomes harmful to others becomes unjust. And you would say that theologically speaking, you don't have a real right to that property. And so if you've done the natural law course, we've talked about this, right? How somebody who's hoarding food during a famine may have a legal right to that warehouse full of bread, but morally speaking, theologically speaking, they do not have a right to that, right? Because they don't have a reasonable claim to that food when people are starving to death outside their doors, outside their gates. And so this is that same sort of idea, but on the level of Catholic social teaching and looking at institutions, right? And so really all material goods, all private property, all money or profit is only valid to the extent that it really promotes the true good of people. And so obviously that's going to be something that's going to come up when we turn to look at discussions of the economy and things like that. Now another aspect of this universal destination of goods that I want to touch on before we move to the other principles is referenced in the compendium, which is called the preferential option for the poor. Now in some, as I mentioned before, sometimes these lists vary a bit, and so in many lists of the principles of Catholic social teaching, you'll see the preferential option for the poor treated as a separate principle. But here in the compendium, they put it within the discussion of this universal destination of goods. But I think it's worth drawing our attention to, because again, As I said, these principles are meant to be sort of a guide, like moral norms in natural law, so that we don't have to kind of go through this very elaborate reasoning process with every decision we're going to make. And this is where something like the preferential option for the poor is particularly important and helpful, right? And it says we can talk about, you know, this balance between private property and the universal destination of goods, and that in many cases it's going to be difficult to strike that balance exactly, right? That we want to encourage the creativity and the industriousness that private property allows, while limiting it and working for the real good of people. But again, that's fairly abstract in many ways, or in many cases. So the preferential option for the poor is in some ways much simpler, right? It simply says in a real basic form that when we are making choices, when we are making a policy decision, we ought always to have a preferential option for the poor, right? We ought always to ask ourselves, maybe first and foremost, how will this affect the poor? How will this benefit the poor? And if we find that it's going to harm the poor, then that's going to be something that we need to address and change. And we should work in a way where we can say, yes, this is going to help the poor in this way. Now, why is this, right? Haven't we said before that Catholic social teaching says that everyone has an equal value, everyone has an equal dignity? Yes, right, there's nothing intrinsically more valuable about a poor person than a rich person, right? But what this principle is kind of putting into shorthand form, if you will, is the fact of prudential judgment, the fact of real life experience that, as it turns out, in most cases, when there's a policy decision being made, the rich and the powerful are going to have ways of making sure that they are not unduly harmed by things, right? So when we are having a debate about where to put a new landfill, for example, right, it's unlikely that a landfill is going to show up in the backyard of the most affluent subdivision in the area, right? That's just not going to happen, and we all know that won't happen because the rich and the powerful certainly have ways to make sure that landfill doesn't show up in their backyard. That is not necessarily the case for the poor and for the marginalized, right? That they are often the ones that no one is speaking for in the normal political or economic decision-making processes. And so that's why we have this specific principle of how will this benefit the poor? Because so often in reality, the poor and the marginalized don't have a voice in the decision-making processes that are going on. And so we ought to just start our discussions with this preferential option for the poor. And that will make sure, at least in some ways, that this universal destination of goods is realized and made part of our decisions. Now, the next principle I want to look at here as we work our way through the compendium is one that does show up in most of the list, but this is probably one of the principles that gets discussed the least, and is probably the one, if we were to write out this list, that many people wouldn't recognize or wouldn't necessarily know what it was talking about, just from being kind of regularly informed, active parishioners or Catholics, or people who try to keep up on issues. Subsidiarity is built into the nature of Catholic social teaching. It's built on this understanding of the human person that we've been talking about. And basically what it says is that we ought to push decision-making processes, we ought to push power to the lowest level possible in a social organization. Right. Another way of looking at this is that that bigger institutions, so nations or societies or states, ought to encourage and develop and strengthen smaller, lower level social institutions, right? So instead of just focusing on the nation or focusing on the global economy, right, that those things should support and advocate for the existence of smaller institutions, the local community, or local civil or civic institutions, or local churches, or clubs, and of course at the smallest level, the family, right? And the idea is that we ought always to do whatever we can on the lowest, smallest level possible. Now, for some of those who have a more kind of conservative political background, this might seem like a very welcome change from some of the other principles we've been talking about, because in many ways it does dovetail with American conservative political view of decentralizing power, of getting away from big government, and putting power back on more local level. And there certainly is a real valid connection there. But one thing to make sure that we note here is that this is not just a quick and easy political slogan about no big government, right? That is maybe part of it, but it is broader and more holistic than that, right? So this would also apply to, say, economic considerations, right? So big corporations would have challenges with subsidiarity the same way that big government does, right? And there the politics get a little more complicated and nuanced, because many of those who would argue against big government would be very opposed to regulations that would limit the size of corporations. But I think subsidiarity could be used to argue for that in much the same way. So why is this a Catholic social teaching principle, right? So those on the right are going to be all for this when it comes to government, but maybe not so much on corporations, and those on the left will have the opposite take on things. But both might ask, how is this really part of Catholic social teaching? Isn't this really just politics? And the answer is no, right? And the answer no follows from an understanding of the human person and the embodied material nature of the human person, and the need to treat people as people and not as tools or numbers or cogs in a machine, right? And basically what subsidiarity says is that the reason that we encourage the small and the local first and foremost is it's on that level, it's on that scale that people are going to most likely be treated as persons, as having that unique transcendent value. And as the scale of your institutions gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it becomes harder and harder to maintain that focus on the individual value of the person. And it becomes much easier, and in some cases almost a necessity, to treat people as just a number, to treat people as just a cog in a vast machine or system. And so subsidiarity is not about politics or economic policies so much as a recognition of the fact that we are relational beings, right? And it's much more likely that I will treat the people I know and see on a daily basis the way they ought to be treated than people who just exist for me on a spreadsheet or in a database or even just in a very abstract form somewhere. Right? So subsidiarity kind of forces us to recognize the humanity of the people affected by our decisions. Now, it does, of course, recognize that there are some things that need to be dealt with on a larger scale. Right? So this doesn't deny that there's a necessity for national government or even international cooperation. Right? But it does say that we should be careful whenever we get on those kind of large scale, because they're going to have an inherent tendency to treat people in the abstract and to treat people as numbers instead of persons. And so subsidiarity will bring up some very interesting discussions, I think, as we go along and look at some of the specific issues in the course. Now, a kind of complement to this idea of subsidiarity is the principle of participation. And this is really kind of a principle that's made possible by subsidiarity in some ways, right? So the principle of participation says that when we are making decisions, when we are setting up our institutions, we ought to do it in a way that allows individuals to have real participation in the decisions that are going to shape their lives. And so when we are setting up our government, when we are setting up our corporations or businesses, when we are setting up any sort of community or social system, we should do it in a way that allows everyone kind of involved, everyone affected, to have a meaningful participation in the process. And so again, on a kind of governmental side of things, this would support small local institutions, right? It could also be used, I think, to support the ideals of democracy, right? That people ought to have a voice in the decisions that shape their lives. So I think many of us would agree with that. But again, it would also be true when it comes to corporations and businesses, right? And This is one where maybe it gets a little more uncomfortable for at least many Americans, right? That when we set up our corporation, we ought to do it in a way that gives people, all the people affected, a real voice in the decisions that shape their lives. Do the people who work in a factory have a meaningful role in guiding the choices that are going to shape their working lives? Do the people who work in some cubicle in some corporate office somewhere have a meaningful involvement in the decisions? Now again, Catholic social teaching is not Marxism, right? It's not saying that we cannot have a hierarchy or that there can be no division between capital and labor. But it is saying that even though those things may be necessary for private enterprise and private property, they need to be balanced by a respect for the humanity and the value of the people who work for us or of the people in businesses. And so participation is also going to raise many kind of interesting issues as we go through a lot of the topics in our course. For example, it will also come up in some of the things that we consider when it comes to charity, right? That when it comes to trying to provide for, say, the poor in sub-Saharan Africa, how ought we to do that, right? And this is actually a conversation that is going on and that there is some debate about, because there's a lot of, I think, valid criticism of many kind of Western celebrities and charities or even governments who come in and try to sort of fix the problems of, say, sub-Saharan Africa. So they're going to come in with a template and the money and we're going to set things up, which may have kind of laudable motives in many ways, but it misses this principle of participation, which would lead us to recognize that the people in these communities we're working in and working with, those people have a right to participate in the decisions about how their society, how their community should be changed, should be shaped. And not only will it be more successful, typically, if they are allowed that input, but it also really just recognizes their value as persons who have a right to participate in decisions that are going to affect their lives. So again, there are many interesting discussions that can follow from just that basic principle of participation that we'll see as we kind of go through the remainder of the class. And then the last principle here I want to touch on in this overview is the principle of solidarity. And the principle of solidarity in many ways, again, here is a complement to some of these others that we've been focusing on. So participation, subsidiarity, the common good, a lot of these principles really draw our attention to and draw our focus to real local communities, right? That there is an important truth to our nature as embodied relational beings, that we do best when we are in real meaningful relationships with other people that we can see and interact with, and that's the sort of context in which we will tend to treat people better as opposed to the abstract. It's a sort of situation where people have an opportunity to meaningfully participate in decisions. And all of that is true. But again, as the compendium notes, we need to make sure that we keep all of these different principles in balance and we accept all of them kind of as a whole, right? And solidarity is a balance to those ideas, right? And solidarity emphasizes the importance of recognizing the personhood, the value of those who are not part of our local community, those who are not kind of immediately connected to us. Of course, solidarity, we've spoke of St. John Paul II before, right? Solidarity is the name of the movement that kind of opposed communism in Poland. And solidarity was this gathering together of people throughout that society to stand in solidarity against communism. And that's similar to what solidarity means here in our context, right? That it is a recognition of and a connection with those who aren't our immediate neighbors, who aren't in our local community. So just as I should be concerned about how people in my company or on my street are affected by a decision, I also need to recognize the value of people around the world. People, in my case, to draw on the example I've been using, the people who pick the coffee that I'm ultimately going to drink, or the people who process that coffee in a plant or in a warehouse somewhere. I will probably never see those people. I will probably never meet those people. It wouldn't be possible to do kind of a dream subsidiarity coffee arrangement here in Kansas. We can't grow coffee locally and on a small scale. So granted all of that, there can be valid international trade, there can be valid international economic arrangements. But when we do those things, we still need to recognize the value and the dignity of the people on that other side of the world or in those other countries who we will never meet. And so solidarity calls on us to acknowledge their rights, to acknowledge their dignity, and to do the best we can in the different institutions, in the different systems that we are a part of, to promote their real good, to promote their true good, right? So when it comes to coffee, again, this is something that people discuss quite a bit, right? This is where the fair trade movement gets its impetus from, right? Is the idea of recognizing that there are real people picking these coffee beans in some other country, and most of those people are quite impoverished, right? So what can I do in order to recognize their rights as a person, to improve their quality of life and let them flourish as people? So fair trade pricing, fair trade agreements is one way that people have adopted to try to live out that principle of solidarity. Now again, whether fair trade coffee is the answer or not is something we can discuss in more detail later on. But that's the sort of idea we have here, right? So it's going to be true in economics. It's also going to be true in politics and the military, right? When there's a debate about a foreign policy decision, and we're talking about the use of force in the Middle East and one of the innumerable countries that we're involved in at any time, we need to recognize that there are real people at the other end of those decisions, people who are going to be innocent victims of attack, or people who are being oppressed by various corrupt governments or evil regimes that we ought to help too. And we need to bear in mind our solidarity with those people on the other side of the world when we are making our decisions. So again, it's going to be complicated in some cases, but this principle of solidarity can at least be a starting point for thinking about how we work through some of these far-flung, complicated decisions in terms of money or politics or the military. So we've looked at the key principles outlined in the compendium that are really going to guide our discussion of the various specific topics that we're going to look at in the coming weeks. And there's a lot to wrap our heads around there. But hopefully these basic principles that we've talked about here will at least give us a starting point for looking at these various complicated issues, right? And it's important, just as we do with natural law, right, that when we face complicated issues, to recognize that we can always step back and get to the basic underlying assumptions to gain some clarity, right? So if we look at a complicated situation like, should I be buying coffee from the international coffee market where all kinds of things might be going on that are problematic or even evil, how do I make a decision about that? Well, I can study what's involved, I can read up on the issues, but of course I can also use these principles we've talked about. I can use principles of participation, of solidarity, of the universal destination of goods. I can use those things to help me sort through some of these issues. And even there, one of the things that we're going to see as we go through these different topics in our course is that sometimes there's going to be tension, right? There's going to be tension between, say, the idea that, well, you know, if I buy coffee, I might be propping up an unjust economic situation where coffee workers who are picking the beans are kind of trapped in poverty, and by buying coffee, I'm sort of keeping them in that situation, perpetuating that institution. But on the other hand, I might think of it in terms of, well, by buying the coffee, I am providing a livelihood for people, and if there were no coffee exports, maybe people would be worse off, right? How do I decide if there seems to be a tension between the different principles that might apply to a situation? Well, again, when we get down to the real nitty-gritty, the difficult choices, and we really want to think it through, that's where we're going to fall back to what we started this module talking about, and that is the nature of the human person and what is really good for the human person, right? And that we want to act in a way that's going to promote that good for as many people as possible. So I want to act in a way that's going to recognize the people involved in the coffee system in the fact that they are real, embodied, individual persons who are part of communities, who are part of institutions on different scales, families, towns, states, what have you, but that also each of them have a unique and transcendent value, right? And to try to act in a situation that is really going to recognize their dignity and allow them to flourish as individuals. And sometimes it's going to be really difficult to know how to do that. But I guess the fundamental thing to take away from this sort of introductory module is that really what the church calls us to do is to do the best we can, to have an informed conscience, and to seek the real good of people, and to make then the best prudential judgment that we can. In this kind of transition period between a good created world that's fallen into sin, that has been redeemed but is still not kind of fully redeemed, unfortunately, sort of the best we can do in many cases is the best we can do, right? But as long as we're honestly striving to seek the true good of other people and to follow these principles of Catholic social teaching as best we can, then we are doing what God would want us to do and what the church would say we ought to be doing. So again, this is just an introduction. You can read what the compendium has to say about these things for yourselves. And then I will look forward to getting your thoughts and questions from the readings on the discussion board.